Hey guys, hey, this is Anne Marie and this is the Anti-HR channel. On this channel, I give employee workplace information and advice to help you guys better navigate HR and your workplace and to understand your rights as an employee in the United States of America and how to navigate HR when you feel those rights have been violated. Today, I want to do a video about something I've talked about before, but I feel like something is missing or getting lost in translation. So I'm going to do one last video called Workplace Retaliation 101 in hopes that more of you will have a better understanding of retaliation before you book a discovery call with me. A lot of people are booking discovery calls with me and claiming retaliation and not necessarily clearly or completely understanding what retaliation is and is not, and also when it matters and when it doesn't matter. Because believe it or not all retaliation is wrongful or illegal or against the law, if you will, or something that is actionable, i.e. something that you should complain about or can file an outside action about. So I want to make sure you guys understand retaliation better and understand when retaliation might be wrongful in your work environment and it makes sense for you to raise it, and when it might be better for you not to raise it because you're just making yourself a target. Okay, so let's get into it. So retaliation happens when your employer punishes you for engaging in what we call a protected activity, something that you have a right to do under the law. So that's like if you file a complaint for discrimination, or you file a complaint because you believe you were treated differently upon return from Family Medical Leave Act, or your job wasn't open for you, or your employer put you on a performance plan as soon as you returned from FMLA, or you asked for a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disability Act and you were put on a PIP. These are examples of the protected activity being complaining about discrimination, the retaliation being put on a PIP. So for example, if you've never had any performance issues, your employer has told you you're a great employee, you're doing a wonderful job, then you notice somebody on your team being sexually harassed, let's say, and you go to HR and you complain about it. You've documented the incidents, you complain that you observed this illegal activity, i.e. the sexual harassment happening, and then you get put on a PIP a week later. And complaints about your performance that you've never heard of are manufactured against you. That would be an example of retaliation for protected activity. Another example might be, again, stellar performance reviews, been working somewhere for 5, 6, 7 years, which to me is a long time to be working somewhere. But let's say you've been working somewhere for 5 years, always got good reviews, never any complaints about your performance. Then you go and ask for a reasonable accommodation for a condition that your doctor now says that you have, and you go and ask for reasonable accommodation, and a week later, you get put on a performance improvement plan and told that your performance is a problem. That, again, might be an example of retaliation for protected activity, okay? So now let's talk about what retaliation might happen that is not necessarily protected. You're in a staff meeting and your manager says something that is not valid, and you raise your hand in the meeting and you correct your manager. And after that, your manager stops speaking to you, and at the next performance review, they start criticizing your performance. Might that be retaliation for what you said in the meeting? Probably yes. Is it actionable? Probably no. Now, that's an example of one, a protected activity, and in the other one, it's not a protected activity. So it's important to understand that retaliation has to follow a protected activity. All retaliation is not wrongful. All retaliation is not illegal. So you have to use discretion and good judgment in your work environment, and don't think that anything you do or say relevant to your manager, especially, will be protected if you complain and say retaliation. Now, in the instance where I talked about the person raising their hand and correcting their manager in a team meeting or staff meeting, let's say that your manager comes after you for that, but that you've observed Becky, Kevin, right? Wang, all doing the same thing in meetings thereafter, and none of them have been put on a performance improvement plan. Well, now you might be able to argue that you're being treated differently because of a protected characteristic, like your race, like your gender, right? Right? But what you're going after them on is the protected class that you might have, a protected characteristic that you might not have, not the fact that they were angry at you for correcting them in the meeting. You have to understand that when you're at work, just like you might feel a type of way when people do certain things, like embarrass you, question your judgment, question your decision making, etc., your manager is a person just like you, and they are likely to react to things just the way that you would. The only difference is they got more power than you. So if you're in a meeting and your manager says something that's incorrect or not true, even if they say it about you, it might be better for you to document the incident in your documentation journal, which you can grab on my website, and talk to your manager about it outside of the meeting, and then follow it up with something in writing, right? Rather than calling them out in front of everybody, right? Use good judgment. Understand the difference between what is protected and what is not protected, and understand that retaliation in and of itself is not the wrongful act. Why they are retaliating is what gets managers in trouble. There's a lot of organizations that have gotten into trouble in legal proceedings, not because of the discrimination claim, but because of all the things they did to the employee after the employee complained about the discrimination claim. Not because of them not paying the person overtime, but because of all the things that they did when the person claimed that they were owed overtime. So it's important to know when you are engaging in a protected activity, what your protected characteristics are, so that if you raise concerns in your workplace around anything that is a protected activity or protected characteristic or class, and your employer, through your manager, engages in retaliation, that then you may have a right to raise these concerns, ask for correction, in up to including requesting a negotiated separation with severance, i.e. asking your manager or your company to pay you to leave the situation and leave your employment. But you cannot yell retaliation just because they hurt your feelings. You cannot yell retaliation, even in many cases, when they engage in behavior that is unethical and unfair, if the action that they are taking does not involve a protected activity or your protected class or characteristic. You might not be protected if you raise concerns about retaliation. You might not be protected if your manager decides to retaliate against you after you raise concerns about the action that they take, or the thing that you observed, or the thing that they said that you didn't agree with in the meeting, or whatever it is. So use good judgment before you raise concerns at work. There are power differences. Your manager has more power in the workplace than you 9 times out of 10. So when you're raising a concern about anything that they do, you need to have all your ducks in a row before you do so. You need to be paying attention to what goes on in your workplace. You need to be paying attention to the dynamics between yourself and your manager and other people on your team. You need to be documenting your workplace so that if anything is off, you have documented it before you go and raise it as a concern, right? And this is not me saying, let people treat you any kind of way, but this is me saying you have to understand and know what is a protected activity versus what is not a protected activity, so that you don't get yourself into hot water that you can't get yourself out of and think that yelling retaliation is going to save you, because it might not. So one more time for the folks in the cheap seats. For retaliation to be illegal, there has to be a clear connection between your protected activity and the negative action that your employer takes against you. If it is not a protected activity, or you don't have a protected class or characteristic that you can claim the negative action flows from or is in connection with that thing, you might not have a leg to stand on if you claim retaliation. So a lot of times people will tell me, oh, they feel they're being retaliated against, and they went to HR and they told HR, and HR didn't do anything. HR didn't investigate. HR hasn't even responded to them. And that's because HR recognizes that the activity that the manager undertook is not a protected activity. And so HR doesn't care, to be blunt. Okay? So make sure you understand what is a protected activity, which I have now explained to you, and what is not. So here are a couple things that you should do and think about if you believe you're being retaliated against. First of all, keep detailed records. Keep track of dates, times, what was said, what wasn't said. Write that shit down. Ask for feedback and changes in writing if this is involving a performance issue, right? So don't just have verbal conversations. Also follow up on those conversations in writing, so that if there is retaliation, you can point to exactly when it started. Now, keep in mind that even though something may not be a protected activity from the standpoint of the law, it might be a protected activity for the purposes of your job's policies. So also know what your policies and procedures say. So, for example, bullying is not illegal. Therefore, in almost every jurisdiction, it is not a protected activity in and of itself, unless you can tie it to a protected class or characteristics, i.e., you're being bullied because of protected class or characteristics. However, many organizations have anti-bullying policies. So in that regard, it might not be an illegal protected activity, but it might be a protected activity which is wrongful from the context of your job's policies and procedures. So make sure you're familiar not just with your workplace rights. And if you need to know more about your workplace rights, I have a whole ebook called The Roadmap to Understanding Your Workplace Rights that you can download. It will be linked to this video to understand your workplace rights in terms of the top 10 federal laws that you need to be aware of as an employee, right? Which are all, if your employer does something that violates any of those, then they are violating a protected activity. However, you need to also know what's in your handbook, so that you know if they're also violating something that's in the handbook. Even though it's not a protected activity from a legal standpoint, they might still be violating a company policy, which gives you grounds to raise a retaliation claim in connection with that policy. Just understand that HR is probably going to be less concerned about violations of company policies that don't also cause them to face legal liability. That doesn't mean you shouldn't raise it and point out that the employer is violating a workplace policy, but you should just understand that violations that involve illegal acts which can cause liability for your employer are the types of things that they're more likely to take seriously. Next thing that you need to make sure you're doing is stay professional, keep doing your job. So even if you feel like your employer has done something that violates your rights, your workplace rights, or violates a company policy, be professional. In all your interactions, be professional. When you're raising a concern, be professional, which is why I said it's better to raise a concern in private than in public and come across as being insubordinate or trying to embarrass your boss, etc. Be professional in all things, including how you raise your concerns. And the last thing, of course, is what I said before, is know your rights. Know what your rights are relevant to your workplace. That means knowing what the company policies are and understanding what your workplace rights are from the federal standpoint as well as the state. Google is free. Information is a commodity now, but it is also an easily accessible commodity. And too many of you are not accessing information that you can readily find. Google is free, and the internet can be a dangerous place because there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. Do not, rely just on some video you saw on TikTok, even mine. You can double check information by going on the internet and Googling things and looking for multiple sources before you decide to rely on it, right? But knowledge is power, so make sure you educate yourself, which is what I'm trying to do with these videos, about what your rights are and are not. One of the reasons that I created the AntiHR community is so that I can help people address these kinds of things in real time. And one of the reasons I'm making this video is because I've had several people in the community ask questions about retaliation, and I've answered those questions in the community. But it made me want to make this video because I realized if people in the community are still misunderstanding their rights and responsibilities relative to retaliation, that some of you might still be misunderstanding it as well. Retaliation is a real thing, but not all retaliation is wrongful or something that you can take action about. So be very thoughtful about when you raise this issue, and be very clear about what is a protected activity that you can raise retaliation claims about, and what are activities that are not protected where you're raising retaliation claims may actually make you a target or a bigger target than you already are. Don't let retaliation push you out silently. Document, protect yourself, and take back your power by being an educated employee. I hope this video was helpful. If it was, please take a minute, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share this video with a friend. Consider joining the Anti-HR community, where you can get answers to these kinds of questions in real time rather than waiting or hoping that I make a video about it. And as always, HR is not your enemy, but they're definitely not your friend, but I am. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.